Hello there, my dreamy travellers. Tonight, beneath the quiet shimmer of gaslit memory, we wander into Mystic Falls, a town where history breathes through cobblestone streets and old money keeps ancient secrets. This is the story of Stefan Salvatore, a man frozen at 17, who lived 170 years in the shadow of what he had done and what he could not stop himself from doing. A story of love, sacrifice, guilt, and the long, painful road toward redemption. So, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let Stefan's story carry you gently through the night. The town of Mystic Falls, Virginia, in the autumn of 1864, was a place suspended between two worlds. The Civil War had been grinding through the South for 3 years by then, consuming young men and old certainties with equal indifference, leaving behind a landscape of grief and diminished expectations. And yet Mystic Falls itself retained something of its pre-war elegance, its founding. Families clinging to the rituals and refinements of plantation society, even as the world those rituals were built upon crumbled at the edges. The Salvatore estate sat at the heart of this world. A grand house surrounded by gardens and outbuildings, presided over by Giuseppe Salvatore, with the firm, unyielding authority of a man who believed order was its own form of virtue. Stefan Salvatore was 17 years old in that autumn. He was the younger of Giuseppe's 2 sons, bookish and earnest where his older brother Damon was restless and magnetic, obedient where Damon was defiant. Stefan had grown up understanding that he was the good son, the one who fulfilled expectations rather than challenged them, who studied the things his father valued and attended the functions his father required and believed, with the sincere faith of someone who has not yet been tested. That goodness was simply a matter of choosing correctly. He was not naive exactly. He understood that the world contained darkness, but he had not yet experienced darkness that came from inside himself, and so he could not fully account for it. Damon was 24 that year, a soldier home from the Confederate Army on what was supposed to be a brief leave. The war had changed him in ways that Stefan could see, but not entirely name. There was something looser in Damon now, something that had been wound tight by military discipline and then released at an angle, not quite where it had been before. He was funnier than Stefan remembered, and crueler, and more alive in some essential way that the war had stripped from so many men, but had paradoxically intensified in Damon. Giuseppe disapproved of this looseness, this refusal to return to the sober young man who had left. The tension between father and elder son had calcified into something neither of them bothered to conceal. Stefan sat between them, as he always had, trying to translate each to the other, believing, as younger brothers often do, that if he found precisely the right words, the fundamental conflict could be resolved. And then Catherine Pierce arrived at the Salvatore estate, and everything else became secondary. She was introduced as a young woman in need of shelter, a refugee of sorts from the disruptions of the war, boarding with the Salvatores under the loose social conventions that allowed for such arrangements. She was extraordinarily beautiful in a way that seemed slightly outside the ordinary scale of human attractiveness, her dark eyes holding a depth and knowingness that felt older than her apparent age. She dressed beautifully. She moved through the Salvatore house as if she had always lived there, occupying space with a natural authority that was part confidence and part something else, something that Stefan could sense but not identify. Both brothers fell for her. This was, in retrospect, entirely by design. Catherine was not what she appeared to be. Beneath the Southern Belle performance, beneath the fluttering eyelashes and the carefully managed vulnerability, she was Katerina Petrova, a 500-year-old vampire who had been running from the original hybrid Klaus Mikkelsen for longer than the Salvatore family had existed. She had come to Mystic Falls deliberately, for reasons that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with what she needed. And the Salvatore brothers were useful to her in specific ways she had already calculated before she ever set foot in their house. She compelled them both. This is important to understand. The feelings Stefan believed he had for Catherine, the feelings Damon believed he had for her, were real in the sense that they were genuinely experienced, genuinely felt, but they had been initiated and amplified by Catherine's vampire compulsion, by her ability to reach into a human mind and adjust what it contained. Stefan would not know this for many years. He would spend a century and a half believing he had loved Catherine Pierce freely, of his own accord, which made everything that followed, everything she did, every choice she made that used him and discarded him, more devastating than it might otherwise have been. But in that autumn of 1864, Stefan knew none of this. He knew only that he was 17 and in love with a woman who seemed to love him in return, who sat with him in the garden and listened to him speak about the books he was reading and the person he hoped to become, who touched his face with gentle hands and looked at him as if he were extraordinary. It was the first time in his life that he had felt seen in that particular way. He would chase that feeling for the next 170 years, finding it and losing it and finding it again, never quite free of the imprint of those weeks, with Catherine in the Salvatore garden. Meanwhile, Mystic Falls was becoming dangerous for her kind. The Founders' Council, the governing body of the town's founding families, of which Giuseppe Salvatore was a prominent member, had been quietly aware of a vampire presence in their community for some time. The war had disrupted their ability to act on this awareness, but by October of 1864, they had gathered enough information, enough names, to move decisively. The plan was systematic. Identify the vampires living among them, administer, Vervain to neutralize their compulsion abilities, round them up, seal them in the basement of Fell's church, and burn it to the ground. Stefan discovered Catherine's true nature before the roundup began. The discovery came with the particular shock of information that reframes everything one thought one understood. She was a vampire, the woman he loved, the woman who had been living in his father's house, was the thing his father had been quietly hunting. And rather than falling apart, rather than reacting with the horror the discovery might have inspired, Stefan's first instinct was to protect her. This says something important about who Stefan was at 17. His love, even a love that had been installed in him by compulsion, overrode his fear and his conditioning. He went to Catherine rather than his father. He chose her over the world he had been raised to believe in. It was not enough. Giuseppe Salvatore had been administering vervain to his sons without their knowledge, and the precaution against exactly this kind of compromise. When Stefan went to Catherine, he found she could not compel him further. The vervain in his blood had neutralized her ability to reach him. He helped her anyway, out of feeling rather than compulsion, and Giuseppe discovered him in the act. What happened next was swift and irreversible. Giuseppe shot Stefan. He shot Damon also, when Damon appeared and revealed that he too had known about Catherine and had chosen to protect her rather than report her. The shots were not accidents, not impulse. Giuseppe Salvatore fired on his own sons because in his calcified moral universe, they had made themselves enemies of everything he valued, and his sense of order was stronger than his love for the children he had raised. Stefan fell in the road outside his own home, bleeding into the Virginia earth, looking up at a sky that seemed indifferent to everything happening beneath it. He was 17 years old, and he was dying, and the last thing he was aware of before the darkness took him was that his father had been the one who pulled the trigger. It was not the last violence Giuseppe Salvatore would commit against his son. But Stefan did not know that yet. He only knew the dark. Stefan Salvatore did not die all at once. That is the nature of the transition, that strange and terrible threshold between human life and vampire existence. Catherine's blood had already been in his system before Giuseppe fired the shot. She had been feeding him her blood in small quantities over the weeks of their acquaintance, a precaution she took with those she wanted to keep close, a habit born of 5 centuries of careful self-preservation. Stefan had not known what he was drinking when she offered it to him. He had not known what it meant, had not understood the implications of the warmth that spread through him afterward, the slight heightening of his senses, the feeling of being more awake than usual. And so when the bullet found him and his body began to fail, the process that followed was not death in the ordinary sense, but something more complicated, more conditional. A door left slightly open in a wall that should have been solid. Damon was in the same position. Giuseppe's second shot had found its mark with the same cold accuracy as the first, and the older Salvatore brother lay somewhere nearby in the gathering dark. Catherine's blood in his veins as well, the same door standing open before him with the same terrible patience. The transition period is a suspension. The body fails, the heart slows, consciousness dims towards something that feels indistinguishable from ordinary death, but is not quite. The vampire blood in the system holds the dying person at a threshold, keeping them between states, offering a choice that most people do not understand they are being given until it is almost too late. To complete the transition, one must feed on human blood. A deliberate act, a conscious consumption, the body crossing from one kind of existence into another. To refuse, or simply to fail to act in time, is to die as a human and stay dead, the door closing quietly on whatever might have been. The choice sounds simple when described in those terms. In practice, standing at that threshold with full awareness of what each direction means, it is anything but. Stefan woke in his own room in the Salvatore house, disoriented and in pain. the wound in his chest already beginning to close in ways that his 17-year-old mind had no framework to explain. The sunlight through the window seemed too bright, almost violent in its intensity, flooding the familiar room with a quality of illumination that felt less like light and more like exposure. The sounds of the house were overwhelming, every creak of floorboard and murmur of distant conversation arriving at equal volume, without the natural filtering his human ears had always performed without his awareness. The smells were the most disorienting of all, layered and specific and relentless, information his senses were delivering whether he wanted it or not. He lay still and tried to understand what had happened to him, and gradually, with the particular horror of assembling pieces of information that lead somewhere unbearable, he began to understand. He sought out Damon and found him in a similar state of confused awakening, seated on the edge of his bed in his childhood room with an expression that Stefan had never seen on his brother's face before. It was not fear exactly, and it was not grief exactly, though both of those things were present inside it. It was something closer to a profound stillness, an unusual absence of the restless energy that had always characterized Damon, as if the transition had stripped away the performance and left something more fundamental and more difficult to look at directly. The brothers sat together in the strange, liminal quiet of those first hours. Two young men who had been shot by their own father and were now suspended in something neither of them had the language to properly describe. They talked, or rather Stefan talked, because that was always Stefan's instinct in a crisis. To articulate, to reason, to find words for things and thereby bring them under some measure of control. Damon listened with that unfamiliar stillness, asking occasional questions, his responses careful in a way that felt deliberate rather than natural. Stefan wanted to complete the transition. He could not entirely explain why, even to himself, even in the privacy of his own careful reasoning. He was frightened of what he was becoming, frightened of the thirst that was already making itself known as a burning pressure at the back of his throat, frightened of the implications of immortality and all the years stretching forward into a future he could not imagine with any clarity. But he was also only 17, and 17 carries within it a fierce and somewhat unreasonable attachment to the idea of continuity, the notion of stopping here, at this particular moment, before anything had truly been built or understood or experienced, felt to Stefan like the one genuinely unbearable outcome available to him. He did not want to die. Not in his father's house, not with his father's bullet in him, not before he had been anything other than Giuseppe Salvatore's good son. He persuaded Damon to complete the transition alongside him, and the persuasion required considerably more than Stefan had anticipated. Damon's hesitation was not born of the same fear that moved through Stefan. Damon had loved Catherine with the full, unguarded force of everything he was, had believed without question that she had been sealed in Fell's church and destroyed with the other captured vampires, and the grief of that loss was so total and so immediate that the prospect of continuing into an immortal existence without her seemed to him genuinely worse than the alternative. He sat with the choice in a way that Stefan could not afford to sit with it, turning it over with methodical grief, testing its weight from different angles, asking himself in the language of genuine consideration whether forever was something he wanted to carry forward into a world that no longer contained the person who had made forever feel like a gift rather than a sentence. Stefan told him that Catherine was worth surviving for. He told Damon that she would want him to live, that choosing death was a surrender to the people who had taken her, that continuing was a form of honoring what they had shared. He believed these things when he said them, or believed them sufficiently to say them with the conviction that Damon needed to hear. The words were enough. Damon made his choice, and both brothers fed, and the transition completed in the way that all transitions do, abruptly, irrevocably, with a finality that renders all previous deliberation beside the point. The world came crashing in. Every sense expanded to an almost unbearable degree in the moments following completion, the human perceptual apparatus having been replaced by something operating on an entirely different scale. Stefan could hear conversations happening in distant rooms as clearly as if the speaker stood beside him. He could hear the heartbeats of the servants moving through the house below, each one distinct, each one accompanied by a warmth of scent that his newly transformed instincts recognized and catalogued with a hunger that bore no resemblance to anything he had previously experienced under that word. The thirst was not a gentle want, not an absence to be filled at leisure. It was a physical imperative that moved through him like weather, like something happening to him rather than something he was experiencing from a position of agency. For most vampires, the first years carry this quality of overwhelming sensation, gradually tapering toward manageability as control develops. The instincts are newest, and the discipline least developed in those early years, and most newly turned vampires cause damage and make choices they regret simply because the gap between impulse and restraint has not yet been bridged by time and practice. This is understood. It is the expected difficulty of the transformation, accounted for in how older vampires approach the newly turned, built into the common wisdom of what the early years require. Stefan was something beyond this ordinary difficulty, and he did not yet know it. Something in his fundamental nature, in the way his emotions had always run close to the surface even as a human, in the particular wiring of who Stefan Salvatore was beneath the careful presentation of who he had tried to be, meant that the amplification wrought by vampire transformation did not merely intensify his feelings, but dissolve the walls between feeling and action. When he was joyful, it was ecstatic and uncontained. When he was sorrowful, it was annihilating. And when the bloodlust rose in him, it rose without ceiling, without the internal architecture that allows most vampires, with effort and over time, to find a workable discipline. The thirst in Stefan was not stronger than in other vampires in terms of simple measurement. It was different in character. It did not respond to the usual negotiations. It did not plateau. It demanded completion with a totality that left very little room for the person Stefan believed himself to be. He did not know this yet. He would learn it in the worst possible way, and the lesson would be taught by the person he loved the most and feared to disappoint most, which is almost always how the worst lessons arrive. Giuseppe Salvatore was still in the house. Stefan encountered him in the way that new vampires encounter things in those first overwhelming hours, without the careful avoidance and deliberate navigation that experience eventually teaches, moving through the space of his own home, on instinct and need rather than intention. What happened in those moments is difficult to reconstruct with perfect clarity, because the Stefan who would later reflect on them was a different creature from the Stefan who lived through them. And memory filtered through decades of guilt is never entirely reliable. What is certain is that Giuseppe Salvatore died with the knowledge that the son he had raised had become the thing he spent his life hunting. The son he had shot. The son he had believed he was protecting the town from. Perhaps even protecting in some calcified and terrible way from the corruption believed Catherine represented. Stefan came back to himself standing in the aftermath of what he had done, and what he felt in the moment established the architecture of everything that would follow for the next 170 years. The horror arrived first, absolute and clarifying, stripping away the residue of the bloodlust and leaving him with the full weight of his actions. The self-recrimination followed immediately, as it always would, as it always did when Stefan returned to himself from the edge of what he was capable of. And beneath both of those things, buried deep in a place Stefan would spend lifetimes trying to seal off and wall up and refuse to acknowledge, was the memory of how it had felt before the horror arrived. How the blood had satisfied something in him that nothing else touched. How the thirst, finally answered completely, had produced something that his conscious mind could only describe as relief. This was the wound at the center of Stefan's existence, not the act itself, terrible as it was, but the gap between how the act felt while it was happening and how it felt in every moment afterward. The gap between the monster's satisfaction and the good man's devastation. That gap would never close. He would spend a century and a half trying to make it smaller through discipline and abstinence and devotion to a rigid moral code, and there would be years, sometimes decades, when the effort seemed to be working. But the gap was always there. The memory of that relief was always there, patient as a tide, waiting for the next time he was not strong enough to hold it back. Damon found him and understood what had happened without needing it explained. His reaction was not the gentleness that grief sometimes produces between brothers. He had agreed to continue living, had agreed to carry the weight of an immortal existence he had not asked for. And now he was looking at his younger brother and understanding something about Stefan that Stefan was only beginning to understand about himself. He made a promise, quiet and flat, and more frightening than rage would have been. He would make Stefan's existence a misery for having persuaded him to choose it. Then he left. Stefan stood alone in the Salvatore house, surrounded by the evidence of what the first night of his immortal life had produced, and he began the long process of learning to carry what he had done. He was 17 years old. He was newly immortal. He had lost his father, his brother, and whatever version of himself he had believed himself to be before the night Giuseppe pulled the trigger. The road ahead of him was very long, and he did not yet know how much of it spend running from himself, and how much of it he would spend with great and painful effort trying to find his way back. Stefan Salvatore left Mystic Falls carrying nothing except the clothes on his back and the beginning of a guilt so vast he could not yet see the edges of it. He moved north first, then west, then south, following no particular logic, except the instinct to put distance between himself and the place where he had become what he was. The road in those early years was solitary and largely shapeless, one town blurring into the next, the decades not yet possessing the distinct character they would acquire with time and experience. He was learning what he was, and the education was ongoing and frequently humiliating. A series of failures and recoveries and failures again that left him with a mounting understanding of the particular nature of his problem. Most vampires, given sufficient time and motivation, develop a workable relationship with the thirst. They learn its rhythms, learn the early warnings that precede a loss of control, learn to feed before the hunger reaches the point where choice becomes difficult. It is never easy exactly, but it becomes manageable in the way that most difficult things become manageable when they are practiced long enough. Stefan practiced. He applied himself to the discipline of control feeding with the same earnest determination he had once applied to his father's expectations, constructing rules and routines and careful habits designed to keep the monster at a manageable distance. It worked intermittently. There were months, occasionally years, when Stefan existed in something approaching the controlled life he was trying to build. He fed on animal blood when he could, on small quantities of human blood when the animal blood proved insufficient, and he moved through the world with a carefulness that was exhausting but sustainable. He kept to himself. He avoided situations that might test his control beyond what his control could bear. He grieved quietly and constantly for his father and for his brother and for the boy he had been before the autumn of 1864 remade him into something else. But the thirst in Stefan did not behave the way it behaved in other vampires. It accumulated rather than simply recurring, built pressure rather than simply demanding satisfaction at regular intervals. And when that accumulated pressure finally found a release point, the results were not the contained failures of a vampire who fed too much on a particular evening. They were something categorically different, something that would eventually give Stefan a name he would spend the rest of his existence trying to outrun. The Ripper of Monterey, 1894. Stefan had been doing well, by his own assessment, for several years before Northern California. He had maintained his discipline, kept to animal blood almost exclusively, avoided the company of large numbers of humans whose collective heartbeats and layered sense created a cumulative pressure that his individual encounters never quite reproduced. He believed, as he had believed before on multiple occasions, that he had found a sustainable equilibrium, that the lessons of the previous years had built something in him that could hold. He was wrong, as he'd been wrong before, but this time the scale of the wrongness was different from anything that had preceded it. What happened in Monterey was not a single loss of control, spiraling into a bad night. It was a complete dissolution, a disappearance of the Stefan who constructed rules and grieved his failures, replaced by something that operated purely on appetite and instinct and the terrible satisfaction of a thirst finally, completely answered. He killed multiple people. The specific number is less important than the quality of what followed, because what followed was the detail that would define the name, the Ripper. When Stefan returned to himself in the aftermath, when the horror assembled itself from the wreckage of his awareness, he found that he had reassembled his victims, arranged the pieces of them with a care that the act of killing had entirely lacked, as if the part of him that felt remorse and the part of him that committed the violence were so completely separated that they operated in sequence rather than in tension. the monster finishing before the man arrived to survey the damage. This became the pattern. This became the thing that made Stefan not merely a dangerous vampire, but a particular kind of horror story, the kind that other vampires told with a mixture of revulsion and something uncomfortably close to awe. The reassembly was never explained satisfactorily, not even by Stefan himself in his more honest moments. The most coherent accounting suggests that it was the good man's response to the monster's work, an attempt at restoration that was futile and knew itself to be futile, but could not help performing itself anyway. The guilt expressed through arrangement, through the careful positioning of what could not be made whole again. It was, in its way, the most honest portrait of Stefan's internal division that existed. The two halves of him, operating in the same body, unable to coexist and unable to fully eliminate each other. The years that followed Monterey deepened the pattern rather than interrupting it. Stefan moved through the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th, in cycles of recovery and relapse that grew longer in their destructive phases and shorter in their restorative ones. He was in New Orleans in the early 1900s, anonymous and largely lost, feeding on human blood with an abandon that the Stefan of Mystic Falls would not have recognized as belonging to the same person. He drifted through cities whose names he would later struggle to recall, not because the memories were lost, but because the person who had made them was not quite him, or was too much him, depending on how one understood the architecture of what he was. Chicago in the 1920s found Stefan at one of the lowest points of his long existence, which is saying something given the competition. Prohibition-era Chicago was a city that had organized itself around the consumption of things officially forbidden, and Stefan fit into it with an ease that should have disturbed him more than it did. He was fully the Ripper by then, not in the sense that he was constantly killing, but in the sense that he had stopped fighting it, had reached a point of exhaustion with the effort of resistance that produced something that looked from the outside like freedom and felt from the inside like drowning slowly. It was in Chicago that he encountered Klaus Mikkelsen for the first time, though he would not retain the memory of it. Klaus was drawn to Stefan in the way that certain forces of nature are drawn to specific conditions, recognizing something in the Ripper that resonated with something in himself, the pleasure of a creature that had surrendered to what it was. Klaus compelled Stefan later, erased the memories of their time together, tucking the knowledge of their association away for future use with the patient calculation of someone who thinks in centuries. What remained of that Chicago period in Stefan's accessible memory was fragmentary. Jazz clubs and blood, and the sense of having been further from himself than he had ever been. He would not remember Klaus, but Klaus would remember him, the person who interrupted this long dissolution, who arrived in Stefan's life at a moment when his trajectory seemed irreversible, was a vampire named Lexi Branson. She was older than Stefan, confident in the particular way of vampires who have made peace with what they are without losing what they were, and she met him at a point when meeting him required a specific kind of courage that she offered without ceremony or expectation of credit. Lexi did not fix Stefan. It is important to be precise about this, because the story of what she did for him is sometimes simplified into a rescue narrative that diminishes both of them. She did not have a technique or a method that bypassed the fundamental difficulty of what Stefan was. What she had was patience of a quality that Stefan had never encountered directed at himself, and a refusal to accept his worst behavior as his final word on the subject of who he was. She would find him in the aftermath of a Ripper episode, and she would stay. She would sit with him through the self-recrimination and the grief and the exhausted declarations that there was no point trying again, that the pattern was too established, that the good man was a fiction he had constructed to make the monster more bearable to himself. She would listen to all of it without flinching, and then she would tell him, with a directness that left no room for comfortable self-deception, that he was not done yet. The recovery she helped him achieve across the latter half of the 1800s and into the 20th century was real, and it was hard won, and it did not hold indefinitely. Stefan relapsed, more than once, more than twice. The cycle was not broken by Lexi's intervention, so much as it was given a counterweight, a force pulling in the opposite direction from the bloodlust that was always pulling toward destruction. Every time Stefan fell, Lexi's voice was somewhere in the memory of the fall, and every time he came back, it was partly because coming back was something she had demonstrated was possible over and over without losing faith in the demonstration. Stefan spent more than a century learning, through repeated and costly experience, the exact shape of what he was. He learned that he could not drink human blood in small quantities and stop. He learned that animal blood, maintained with discipline, could keep him functional and present in a way that nothing else reliably could. He learned that emotional pain was the most dangerous condition for him, that grief and loss and guilt created precisely the internal pressure that the thirst knew how to exploit. He learned that he needed Lexi, or someone like Lexi, or at least the idea of Lexi, to exist in a way that didn't eventually consume everything around him. By the time Stefan Salvatore began making his way back toward Mystic Falls in the early years of the 21st century, he had been a vampire for 145 years. He had killed more people than he could accurately count. He had recovered from more relapses than most vampires survive. He had built and demolished and rebuilt the identity of the good Stefan so many times that the construction process had become a kind of expertise, something he could do with a thoroughness and sincerity that was genuine, even knowing it might not last. He was not healed. He would not have claimed to be healed. But he was, in the autumn of 2009, in one of the better periods of his long and complicated life, maintaining his animal blood diet with the disciplined care of someone who understood exactly what the alternative looked like. He was ready, or as ready as he would ever be, for whatever came next. He did not know that what came next would test everything he had built more thoroughly than anything that had come before it. He did not know that a girl in a cemetery was about to change the entire orientation of his existence. He only knew the road back to Mystic Falls, and the quiet that hung over it, and the careful, practiced stillness of a man who had learned to carry his darkness without letting it lead. Stefan Salvatore did not return to Mystic Falls because he had resolved anything. He returned because the pull of the place had become stronger than his reasons for staying away, which is not the same thing as being ready, though he had learned over 145 years that readiness was largely a fiction people told themselves to justify the moment they finally moved towards something they had been circling for a long time. He had been living quietly in a series of small towns in the mid-Atlantic states for the better part of a decade, maintaining his animal blood diet with the practiced discipline of someone who understood what slipping looked like and had no interest in finding out how far the current drop would take him. The existence was manageable. It was not particularly meaningful, but Stefan had made a kind of peace with the distinction between manageable and meaningful, had accepted that for someone with his particular history and his particular nature, manageable was an achievement worth respecting. And then something drew him back. He would describe it later as instinct, as a pull he could not fully articulate. The way certain places hold a claim on the people shaped by them regardless of what those people did there or what was done to them. Mystic Falls was where he had been born and where he had died and where he had become what he was. And those three facts gave it a weight in his internal landscape that no amount of distance had ever entirely dissolved. He drove into town on a September evening in 2009 and felt the particular quality of the air, the specific smell of Virginia autumn, settle over him with a familiarity that was equal parts comfort and grief. He did not go to the Salvatore boarding house immediately. He drove through town first, reacquainting himself with the geography of a place that had changed considerably in a century and a half while retaining something essential about its character. The founding families still dominated the social architecture. The Founders' Council still existed, though its original purpose had been buried under layers of civic respectability. The old buildings stood alongside newer ones, the town having grown without losing the particular self-regard of a community that believed its history made it significant. He went to the cemetery. He went there to visit his family's graves, which he did periodically regardless of where he was living. A ritual that served no practical purpose, but which he had never been able to entirely abandon. Standing at his father's grave was always complicated in ways that defied simple description. The grief and the guilt so thoroughly entangled that separating them was not possible and perhaps not useful. He had killed Giuseppe Salvatore. He had also loved him in the way that sons love difficult fathers, incompletely and with significant conditions, but genuinely nonetheless. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and Stefan had learned to stand inside that contradiction without needing to resolve it. He was standing there in the early evening light when he became aware of another presence in the cemetery, a girl, young, perhaps 17, with dark hair and a quality of stillness about her that suggested she was not there casually, that she too was visiting grief rather than passing through it. She moved between the graves with a familiarity that spoke of repeated visits, and when her face turned in the fading light, Stefan felt the world tilt in a way that had nothing to do with the supernatural, and everything to do with the simple, staggering fact of what he was seeing. She looked like Catherine. Not approximately. Not in the general way that brunette young women of similar height might superficially resemble one another. She looked like Catherine with a specificity that reached into Stefan's chest and did something complicated to his capacity for calm. The same dark eyes, the same particular architecture of the face, the same way of holding herself. He stood very still, the way he had learned to stand when something required him to think before he moved, and he looked at her across the quiet rows of graves and tried to understand what he was experiencing. It was not, he would determine in the days that followed, what he had initially feared it might be. Catherine was Catherine, manipulative, ancient, dangerous, the original wound around which so much of his existence had organized itself. This girl had Catherine's face, but she did not have Catherine's quality of attention, the predatory awareness that Catherine brought to every room she entered. This girl was simply grieving, quietly and privately, in a cemetery on an autumn evening, and the grief on her face was as uncomplicated and human as anything Stefan had seen in a very long time. He left without approaching her. He was not ready for that yet, and he understood himself well enough to know when he needed more time before he took an action he could not take back. Her name was Elena Gilbert. He learned this easily enough. Mystic Falls was still the kind of town where a few careful questions yielded most of the information one needed. And with her name came context. She was the daughter of Grayson and Miranda Gilbert, both recently deceased, killed in a car accident off Wickery Bridge the previous spring. She was living with her aunt, had an adopted brother named Jeremy, was entering her junior year at Mystic Falls High School. She was, by every account, a good person navigating an enormous loss with more grace than most adults could have managed. Stefan enrolled at the high school. This was not an impulsive decision, though it may have appeared that way from the outside. He thought about it carefully, considered the risks, considered what he was doing and why, and arrived at the enrollment as a considered choice rather than an impulse. He wanted to know her. The resemblance to Catherine was a fact he needed to understand, and understanding it required proximity, and proximity required a context that made his presence in her life explicable rather than suspicious. He was aware, in that careful way he had developed over decades, of the risk embedded in this reasoning. He had told himself similar things before, had constructed similar justifications for approaching situations that his better judgment suggested he should avoid. But the draw toward Eleanor Gilbert was not the same as the compelled infatuation Catherine had manufactured in him in 1864. It was quieter than that, more considered. It felt less like a tide pulling him, and more like a direction he was choosing. The first day of school arrived with the particular quality that first days have in small towns. The whole community recalibrating around the fact of Stefan Salvatore's return. The Salvatore name still carried weight in Mystic Falls, and his enrollment generated the mild social curiosity that any new student generates, amplified slightly by the historical resonance of who his family had been. He navigated this with the ease of someone who had navigated hundreds of first days in hundreds of schools across a century and a half. The performance of ordinary teenage existence so thoroughly practiced that it required almost no conscious effort. He had his daylight ring, fashioned long ago, that allowed him to move through sunlit spaces without the exposure that would otherwise make ordinary life impossible. He had his diet of animal blood, carefully maintained. The cooler he kept in his room at the boarding house stocked with what he needed to stay controlled and present. He had his history with this town and his knowledge of its rhythms, which gave him a navigational advantage that a genuinely new student would not have possessed. And then he walked into the first class of the day And Elena Gilbert was there, and the careful architecture of his preparation met the reality of her and held, which was not nothing. He had been afraid it might not. They met properly that day, with the slightly formal awkwardness of two people who are aware of each other's significance before they have any legitimate reason to be. Eleanor was gracious and slightly guarded, the guardedness of someone who had learned recently that the world could be cruel without warning and who was adjusting her assumptions accordingly. Stefan was careful and warm, threading the needle between approachable and overwhelming, trying to be present without being too much. He noticed immediately the way she was not Catherine, where Catherine's attention had always been slightly elsewhere, always calculating the angle. Elena looked directly at the person she was talking to, with a quality of genuine focus that Stefan found unexpectedly disarming. She asked questions that were actually curious rather than strategically deployed. She laughed at things that were genuinely funny rather than performing amusement for effect. She was kind to people in passing, in the small, unremarked ways that revealed character more accurately than grand gestures do. She was, Stefan realized across those first days, entirely herself. There was no performance in her, or very little. The ordinary social performances that everyone engages in, but nothing beneath them. No hidden machinery running a separate agenda. For someone who had spent 145 years surrounded by creatures for whom concealment was a basic condition of existence, including himself, Elena's transparency was startling. Their relationship developed with a naturalness that Stefan had not anticipated and was not entirely prepared for. She was drawn to him with a curiosity that was partly about who he was and partly about the mystery he represented, the quality of otherness that he could never entirely conceal regardless of how well he performed normalcy. He was drawn to her with a feeling that built gradually rather than arriving all at once, which was different from what he had experienced with Catherine and different from what he had expected to experience again. Damon's return complicated everything before it had properly begun. Damon arrived in Mystic Falls with an agenda he did not conceal from Stefan and concealed entirely from everyone else. He believed Catherine was sealed in the tomb beneath Fell's Church, had believed this for 145 years, and he had returned to open the tomb and free her. The plan was characteristically Damon, direct, unconcerned with collateral damage, utterly confident in its own logic. He began immediately creating the chaos that would force Stefan to manage consequences rather than simply living his own life. The dynamic between the brothers in those early weeks was the same dynamic that had always existed between them, sharpened by a century and a half of accumulated grievance. Damon dismantled, Stefan repaired. Damon threatened the people Elena cared about with a casual cruelty designed less as genuine malice and more as a reminder to Stefan that nothing Stefan built was beyond Damon's ability to reach. Stefan endured it, managed it, tried to protect Elena and her friends from consequences that were arriving directly because of his presence in their lives. He told Elena what he was. The decision came sooner than he had planned, accelerated by circumstances that made continued concealment untenable. The conversation happened on an evening when the pretense had become too heavy to carry, when enough had happened that asking her to continue without the full truth felt like its own form of manipulation. He told her in the careful way he told most hard truths, thoroughly, without softening the most difficult parts, giving her the complete information she needed to make a genuine choice about what she wanted to do next. Her reaction was not simple, and he had not expected it to be. She was frightened, and then she was angry, and then she was something harder to name. A combination of the grief of learning that the world contained more darkness than she had known, and the particular complicated feeling of discovering that someone you have been drawn to is genuinely other in ways that matter. She did not immediately accept. She withdrew, considered, sat with the information in the way that people of genuine integrity sit with difficult information, taking it seriously rather than rushing toward a conclusion that would make them feel better. She came back, not because she had resolved all of her fear, not because the situation had become simpler, but because she was who she was, and who she was had determined that running from hard things was not how she intended to live. Stefan recognized this quality in her with something close to reverence. It was the thing about Elena Gilbert that would anchor him, challenge him, and ultimately change him more thoroughly than any of the 145 years that had preceded her. He was not ready for any of what was coming. He was not ready for Damon's escalating interference, for the complications of the Founders' Council, for the truths about Catherine that were still waiting to be discovered. He was not ready for what loving Elena would cost him or what it would ask of him. But he was, for the first time in a very long time, somewhere he genuinely wanted to be. And that, after everything, was its own form of grace. The truth about Catherine Pierce did not arrive all at once. It assembled itself across weeks and months in Mystic Falls, piece by piece, each new fragment recontextualizing what had come before it, until the complete picture emerged with a clarity that was worse than any of the partial versions Stefan had been carrying for 145 years. Catherine was alive. She had not been sealed in the tomb beneath Fell's Church in 1864. She had escaped through means that spoke to the particular quality of her self-preservation instincts, the 500-year-old vampire's ability to identify the moment when a situation was about to become fatal and move before that moment fully arrived. While Stefan had been dying in the road outside the Salvatore estate, while Damon had been doing the same, while their father had been congratulating himself on having protected his town from the corrupting influence of vampires, Catherine had been making her way out of Mystic Falls with the efficient pragmatism of a creature who had survived 5 centuries by never allowing attachment to override survival. She had left them, both of them, Stefan and Damon, dying in the autumn dark with her blood in their veins, transforming into the very thing Giuseppe Salvatore had feared, and she had not looked back, not because she lacked the capacity for feeling, though that was a reasonable thing to wonder about her, but because looking back had never served Catherine particularly well, and she had long since trained herself out of the habit. Stefan sat with this information when it finally became undeniable, and the sitting was one of the harder things he had done in a long life full of hard things. Not because the love itself had been irreplaceable. He understood now, had understood for some time, that the love he had felt for Catherine in 1864 had been at least partly the product of her compulsion, installed and maintained rather than freely grown. But because the grief of 145 years had been organized around a specific story, The story of a woman he had loved, who had been destroyed before they could resolve anything between them. And that story had given the grief a shape and a meaning that the truth now dismantled entirely. He had been mourning a fiction, not the loss itself. Damon's departure, his father's death, the destruction of his human life, those were real regardless of Catherine's survival. But the particular quality of the mourning, the sense of something precious and unfinished, cut short by violence that had been built on a foundation that did not exist. Catherine had not been taken from him. She had chosen to leave. The distinction should perhaps have been less significant than it felt, but grief does not organize itself according to what should matter. It organizes itself around what does. Katerina Petrova, that was her real name, the name she had been born with in Bulgaria in 1473, before she became Catherine Pierce, before she became the vampire who had walked into the Salvatore house in 1864 and rearranged everything inside it. She was a Petrova doppelganger, the original one in the line that had eventually produced Elena, and she had been running from Klaus Michelsen for nearly 500 years because Klaus needed her blood for a ritual that would break the hybrid curse binding his werewolf nature. She had fled her maker, had fled Klaus, had fled every situation that threatened to make her useful to someone else's agenda in a way that might cost her her life. Mystic Falls in 1864 had not been a love story for Catherine. It had been a strategic pause, a place to hide and gather resources and wait out a particular period of danger. The Salvatore brothers had been part of that strategy. Their feelings for her, the feelings she had carefully cultivated and chemically enhanced through compulsion, had served a purpose in keeping her sheltered and protected during her time there. When the purpose was no longer served by staying, she had left. Stefan understood this intellectually, in the way that one can understand a thing completely in the mind, while the understanding arrives at the body much more slowly and incompletely. He was not a naive person, had not been naive for a very long time. He knew what Catherine was, but knowing what she was and fully absorbing the specific uses to which she had put his 18-year-old heart were two different categories of knowledge, and the second one required time to settle into something he could carry without it destabilizing everything around it. He did not have much time, because Catherine's survival raised an immediate and pressing question about Damon. Damon had returned to Mystic Falls specifically to open the tomb beneath Fell's church, driven by 145 years of belief that the woman he loved was sealed inside it, that she had been suffering in that stone darkness since 1864, that freeing her was a purpose that justified whatever means were required to achieve it. This belief had structured Damon's entire existence in ways that went beyond simple motivation. It had given him something to organize his considerable capacity for obsession around, a fixed point in the rotating chaos of his immortal life. It was not true. Catherine was not in the tomb, and Damon did not know this yet. Stefan's position in relation to this information was painful in a specific way that was difficult to explain to someone who did not understand the particular texture of his relationship with Damon. He loved his brother in the complicated and often inarticulate way that brothers love each other after long damage and longer history. He also knew that the truth about Catherine would devastate Damon in a manner that went beyond ordinary grief. would reach into the architecture of his existence and destabilize the very framework Damon had been using to hold himself together for a century and a half. And Stefan did not know, when he considered this prospect, whether Damon would survive it in any meaningful sense, whether what came out the other side would still be recognizably his brother. The tomb was opened. The process required a specific alignment of circumstances, a Bennett witch, a comet, the correct combination of elements that the grimoires demanded, and it was achieved despite Stefan's reservations and Eleanor's fear and all the complications of a mystic fool's that was becoming increasingly aware that the supernatural world it had spent generations trying to eradicate had never actually gone anywhere. 27 vampires emerged from the tomb, starving and disoriented and dangerous, having spent 145 years in a state of desiccated suspension. Their emergence created immediate chaos, the practical problem of 24 starving vampires in a small Virginia town, requiring the kind of urgent management that displaced every other concern temporarily. Stefan moved through the crisis with the focused efficiency he had developed across a lifetime of managing consequences, containing what could be contained, addressing what demanded immediate address. Catherine was not among them. Damon stood at the entrance to the open tomb and understood this fact, and Stefan watched him understand it from a distance that felt both physically and emotionally accurate. The collapse of 145 years of certainty did not look, from the outside, as dramatic as it should have. Damon went very still, in the way he went still when something was happening that he had not prepared himself to experience. His thoughts were not audible, of course, but Stefan had known his brother long enough to read the quality of his silences, and this one had a texture to it that Stefan had not encountered before. Catherine had known the tomb would be opened, had probably anticipated it, had possibly even facilitated it from a distance, understanding that Damon's obsession would eventually produce this moment, and that the moment would produce useful chaos. She had not warned him, had not seen any reason to alter his 145 years of misplaced devotion with accurate information, because accurate information would have freed Damon from a belief that kept him predictable and therefore manageable. Stefan said nothing useful in the immediate aftermath. There was nothing useful to say. He stayed near Damon in the way that he had always stayed near him in the hardest moments, present without demanding acknowledgement of the presence, available without requiring the vulnerability to be performed. Elena watched all of this with the particular attention she brought to the people she cared about, and Stefan was aware of her watching and was grateful for her presence without quite being able to say so. Their relationship had been deepening through the accumulated weight of shared crisis, through the specific intimacy of facing difficult things together, through the way Elena met each new complication with a steadiness that Stefan found both admirable and genuinely useful for his own equilibrium. She had accepted what he was, what his world was, in the full sense now, other than the initial intellectual acknowledgement. She had been inside the crisis of the tomb opening, had understood the stakes and remained. The choice to stay, made again and again as each new layer of difficulty revealed itself, meant more to Stefan than the initial acceptance had, because the initial acceptance had been made without full information, and these subsequent choices were made with all of it. Mystic Falls settled back into its surface calm in the weeks following the tomb opening, the way it always did, the founding families pulling the curtain of civic normality back across whatever had just occurred. But the world had shifted in ways that could not be shifted back. The tomb vampires were loose, several of them harboring old grievances against the founder families that 145 years of starvation had not diminished. Catherine was alive and somewhere, her agenda unknown and therefore more threatening than any known enemy. And something else was coming. Stefan could feel it in the way that creatures who have survived long enough develop a sensitivity to the approach of things larger than the immediate present. The Catherine revelation had answered one question and opened a dozen others. Chief among them, the question of what had frightened someone as formidable as Catherine badly enough to run for 5 centuries without stopping. Whatever that answer was, it was moving toward Mystic Falls with the patient certainty of something that had been moving in that direction for a very long time and did not intend to be redirected. Stefan held Eleanor's hand in the quiet of an ordinary evening and let himself exist inside the moment without trying to see past it. He had learned, across a very long life, that the moments of genuine peace were worth inhabiting fully precisely because they did not last. The darkness was coming, as it always came, but it was not here yet. Catherine Pierce returned to Mystic Falls in the late summer of 2009 with a particular quality of disruption that only someone who understands a place completely can create inside it. She did not arrive announcing herself. She arrived as Elena, wearing Elena's face and Elena's clothes and Eleanor's manner with a precision that spoke to how carefully she had been watching from whatever distance she had been watching from. And the confusion she created in those first hours was calculated to maximum effect before anyone understood that she was there at all. Stefan recognized the difference almost immediately. He had spent enough time with Elena by then to know the specific texture of her presence, the quality of attention she brought to a room, and Catherine's imitation of it was excellent but not perfect. Catherine was too knowing, too contained in a way that Eleanor never quite was. Eleanor's openness being the thing that Catherine could replicate on the surface, but could not reproduce in its essence. The recognition came as a cold settling in Stefan's chest. The particular feeling of something he had hoped was finished revealing itself to be very much not finished. She had come back for reasons that became clearer across the weeks that followed. Reasons that had nothing to do with the Salvatore brothers and everything to do with what was coming. Catherine was afraid. This was the most important thing to understand about her return, beneath all the manipulation and the strategic misdirection and the chaos she created simply by existing in proximity to people who had reasons to react to her. The thing that had been chasing her for 5 centuries had not stopped, had never stopped, and its arrival in the orbit of Mystic Falls was close enough now that Catherine's calculations had produced a specific conclusion. She needed leverage, and Mystic Falls was where the leverage was. His name was Klaus Mikkelsen. The original vampire mythology entered Stefan's understanding in pieces, the way most genuinely world-altering information enters understanding. Incompletely at first, with the full shape of it only becoming apparent once enough, pieces were assembled. The originals were the first vampires, the progenitors of every vampire bloodline that had come after them. created by dark magic in a time before written history. They could not be killed by the means that killed ordinary vampires. White oak ash, a white oak stake through the heart. These were the specific requirements for original death, and both conditions were difficult to meet in practice. They had been walking through human history for 1,000 years. Klaus was the most dangerous of them, which was saying something given the family he belonged to. He was not merely an original vampire. He was a hybrid, the product of his mother's original vampire magic, meeting the werewolf bloodline that his true father carried, a combination that had been suppressed by a binding curse for a millennium, and that Klaus had been trying to break for nearly as long. The breaking of the curse required specific elements assembled in the specific order, and one of those elements was the blood of a Petrova doppelganger, Elena. Stefan absorbed this information and felt the world rearrange itself around the new fact of it. Everything Catherine had done, every choice she had made across 5 centuries, had been organized around evading this specific use. She had been the doppelganger before Elena, had fled rather than be sacrificed, had spent hundreds of years in motion precisely because standing still long enough to be found meant becoming the instrument of Klaus's curse-breaking ritual. And now there was another doppelganger, living in the same small Virginia town where Catherine had once hidden, and Klaus was coming. The revelation about Elena's true origins deepened the complexity of Stefan's feelings in ways he did not entirely have language for. She was not, as it turned out, the biological daughter of Grayson and Miranda Gilbert. She was adopted, the biological daughter of a woman named Isabel, who was herself a descendant of the Petrova line, and the adoption had been arranged specifically to conceal Elena's origins from anyone who might be looking for another doppelganger. This information arrived in stages, each stage requiring Elena to reconstruct her understanding of her own history, which she did with the particular grace that had become one of Stefan's primary reference points for what genuine courage looked like in practice. The originals began making their presence felt before Klaus himself arrived. Elijah Mickelson came first, composed, cultured, ancient in a way that made every other vampire Stefan had encountered seem recent by comparison. Elijah operated according to a code that was genuinely his own rather than performed, and he made a deal with Elena that Stefan found both admirable in its logic and terrifying in its implications. He would protect her and the people she loved from Klaus's less discriminating approach to the problem, in exchange for Elena's cooperation in a plan Elijah had constructed to neutralize Klaus permanently. Elena agreed with a decisiveness that Stefan respected even as it frightened him. Damon's response to all of this was characteristically direct and characteristically insufficient. He wanted to fight, wanted to find a solution that did not require Elena to be at risk, wanted to locate the aggressive action that would resolve the threat and eliminate it. Stefan understood the impulse, had felt it himself, but had also lived long enough to know that wanting a simpler solution did not produce one, and that acting as though the simpler solution existed when it did not was a way of making everything worse. The brothers disagreed in the specific way they had always disagreed. Damon moving toward confrontation, and Stefan trying to navigate complexity, each finding the other's approach incomplete. The summer and autumn of 2010 moved through a series of complications, revelations, and escalating dangers that tested every relationship Stefan had built in the previous year. Catherine re-entered the Salvatore brothers' lives with the specific damage only she knew how to inflict, not through direct violence, but through the precision of her knowledge of them, her understanding of exactly where each of them was most vulnerable, and her willingness to press there without compunction. She fed Damon her blood knowing he had been bitten by a werewolf, the only cure being the blood of an original, Klaus's blood specifically. She did this casually, as a means to another end, the way Catherine always did things that affected other people catastrophically. Klaus arrived in Mystic Falls wearing another person's body, which was a capacity Stefan had not encountered before, and which required a significant revision of his understanding of what the original hybrid was capable of. He eventually reclaimed his own form, and when he stood before Stefan in his true shape, the weight of his age was palpable in a way that went beyond the physical. Klaus carried 1,000 years of existence with a kind of relaxed authority that Stefan recognized as genuinely earned rather than performed, and the recognition produced in him something he would not have called fear exactly, but which occupied a similar space. Klaus had not forgotten Chicago. This was the information that arrived for Stefan with the particular force of things that have been waiting, and the compelled memories Klaus removed from Stefan's mind restored a period of his existence that he had been living without, a significant gap in his own history suddenly filled with things he did not entirely want to know. They had been close in that terrible lost period of the 1920s. Klaus had recognized something in the Ripper that he valued, had been drawn to the completeness of Stefan's surrender to his own darkness, and what had existed between them in those jazz-soaked Chicago years had been a genuine connection of a kind, even if the connection was built on the worst of what Stefan was. Klaus wanted the Ripper back. This was his leverage over Stefan, the specific instrument he intended to use, not a threat to Stefan directly, but something considerably more refined. The sacrifice ritual was approaching, the elements assembling, and Damon had been bitten by a werewolf and was dying from the venom, and the only thing standing between Damon and death was Klaus's blood, which Klaus would provide only in exchange for Stefan's agreement to return to his service, to become again what he had been in Chicago, to let the Ripper out. Stefan agreed. He agreed without consulting Elena, without consulting Damon, making the decision with the particular decisiveness of someone who understands that the luxury of deliberation is not available in all situations. He would give Klaus what he wanted, would pay whatever the Ripper cost in exchange for his brother's life and a clean resolution to the immediate threat. The sacrifice ritual happened on a night that cost more than Stefan had calculated when he made his agreement. The elements were assembled on the night of a full moon. A werewolf, a vampire, the doppelganger. And despite every effort that had been made to prevent it or redirect it, the ritual proceeded. Jenna Summers, Elena's aunt, had been turned into a vampire by Klaus, specifically to serve as the vampire element of the sacrifice. Her transformation sudden and violent and unasked for. She died in the ritual circle with a bravery that Stefan found almost unbearable to witness. A woman who had known about the supernatural world for such a short time dying inside it with more dignity than the situation warranted. Elena died too, briefly. Technically, the death required by the ritual before Bonnie Bennett's magic intervened, pulling her back across the threshold before the death became permanent. The moments between Elena's death and her return were the longest of Stefan's recent existence. Standing outside the circle's perimeter, understanding that he had agreed to Klaus's terms in order to save Damon and had not saved Elena, that the sacrifice had proceeded regardless, that the price had been paid and the payment had included people he had not intended to offer. She came back. Her heart resumed. She woke on the ground with the night sky above her and Stefan's face in her immediate field of vision. And the relief that moved through him was the kind that reorganizes a person around its own intensity, that reveals by contrast how completely one has braced for the alternative. Klaus survived the ritual because Bonnie's plan to destroy him in the aftermath failed, because Klaus had taken precautions that they had not accounted for. He was alive. He was a hybrid now, fully what he had been trying to become for 1,000 years, and his attention turned immediately to the next phase of his plans, which required Stefan specifically. The aftermath settled over Mystic Falls with the particular weight of grief that follows events too large to process immediately. Jenna was gone. Elena had died and returned, and was processing what that meant. Damon was alive. Klaus was alive and more powerful than before. And Stefan had made a promise to a 1,000-year-old hybrid that he now had to keep. He told Elena what he had agreed to. He told her in the way he had learned to tell her hard truths, which was directly and without softening the parts that were most difficult to hear. She did not accept it easily. She did not have the simple acceptance that might have made the leaving feel less like abandonment. She argued against it, found alternative approaches, tried to find a way through that did not require Stefan to walk back into the darkness he had spent decades trying to stay out of. There was no way through that she could find, and Stefan had already decided. He left with Klaus in the early hours of a morning that was quiet in the way that mornings are quiet after catastrophe, the town not, yet having absorbed what it had lost. He drove away from Mystic Falls in Klaus's company, leaving behind Elena's face in the window of the house he had come to think of as a kind of home. And he let himself hold that image for the miles it was visible, and then set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that looking back is not a luxury the current situation allows. He was going back to the Ripper. He had chosen it this time, for reasons he believed were good. He was not certain that made it better. He was not certain it did not. The road out of Mystic Falls felt different from every other road Stefan had taken away from that town across the preceding century and a half. Those departures had been flights, driven by grief or guilt, or the simple necessity of distance between himself and what he had done. This departure was a choice made with open eyes, a step taken towards something rather than away from it, and the distinction did not make it easier. If anything, the deliberateness of it made it harder to carry, because there was no ambiguity to hide inside, no circumstance to blame. Stefan had looked at the available options and chosen this one, and that clarity would sit with him through everything that followed. Klaus was not a cruel companion in the immediate sense. He did not mock Stefan's situation or press on the obvious wounds of leaving Elena and Mystic Falls behind. He had what he wanted, and what he wanted was Stefan's compliance. And he understood well enough that grinding Stefan down in the early days was not the way to get a useful Ripper. He needed Stefan functional, needed the particular focused darkness of the Ripper's appetite, rather than the paralyzed self-destruction of a vampire pushed past his breaking point. So he was almost pleasant in those first weeks on the road, in the way that predators can be pleasant when they have already won. They travelled. Klaus had plans that required movement across the country, a project he had been building towards since the hybrid curse had been broken, which involved creating a hybrid army by turning werewolves using Elena's doppelganger blood. The process was not working correctly, the new hybrids dying rather than transitioning. And Klaus's response to this frustration was to move faster, try more combinations, apply the relentless pressure of someone who has waited 1,000 years for something and cannot understand why the 1,001st year is not producing results. Stefan served as an enforcer in this enterprise, the threat of him useful in ways that did not always require the threat to be acted upon. The humanity switch is not a literal mechanism, though it is sometimes described as one. It is more accurate to say that vampires have the capacity to suppress their emotional responses past a certain threshold, to reach a state in which the feelings that ordinarily constitute personhood, love, guilt, grief, empathy, the whole architecture of caring about consequences, become inaccessible rather than simply muted. It is not a comfortable state, exactly, but it is an anesthetic one. And for Stefan, whose emotional responses had always been amplified past ordinary vampire levels, the appeal of the switch was the appeal of silence. After years of unmanageable noise, he turned it off. Not all at once, not in a single deliberate act, but gradually over the first weeks with Klaus, each suppression building on the last, each act of Ripper violence making the next one marginally less available to the part of him that registered and recorded such things. He did not do it because Klaus demanded it, though Klaus's presence made it easier by providing a context in which feeling was simply impractical. He did it because the alternative was carrying the weight of leaving Elena at full emotional volume, and that weight, he had calculated, would break him before it made him useful to anyone. The trail of bodies that Stefan left across the American South and Midwest in the autumn and winter of 2010 was not random. It had its own logic, the Ripper's logic, which was not the logic of a creature that had lost its intelligence, but of one that had redirected that intelligence entirely away from the concerns of the person it had been, and toward the pure operational demands of what it currently was. He was efficient. He was thorough. He did not reassemble his victims in this period the way the earlier Ripper had, because the reassembly had been the good man's response to the monster's work, and the good man was not currently available to respond to anything. Elena did not accept his absence. This reached Stefan in fragments, through Klaus's occasional references to the situation in Mystic Falls, and through Damon's attempts to locate them, which Stefan was aware of through Klaus's monitoring of those attempts. Elena was looking for him, not in the passive sense of hoping he would return on his own terms, but actively, with the specific determination she brought to every difficult thing, working through the information available to her to find where he was and what was happening to him. Stefan received this information in the flattened way that turned off emotions receive information, registering it factually without being moved by it. He told himself she was wasting her time. He told himself this in the affectless language of a person who has successfully suppressed the capacity to feel what they are saying, and the absence of feeling was almost convincing. Almost because there were moments, not many and not long, but they existed. Small breaks in the suppression where the real Stefan surfaced briefly, like a person coming up for air who then chooses to go back under because the surface is too cold and the deep water is at least predictable. In these moments, Eleanor's face was present in his mind with a vividness that the switch had not entirely eliminated, and what he felt in those moments was complicated in ways he could not afford to examine. He went back down each time, deliberately, efficiently, the way he did everything in this period. Damon arrived in person eventually, having tracked them across several states with the persistence that characterized his brother at his most focused. Their reunion was not warm. Stefan's response to Damon's presence was the Ripper's response. Assessment, mild amusement, the specific condescension of a creature that has shed the emotional obligations of brotherhood and is watching someone operate from a position of feelings he no longer shares. He was cruel to Damon in this period in ways that were calculated to wound, using his complete knowledge of his brother's vulnerabilities to do the most damage with the least effort. He said true things in the way that people without empathy say true things, stripped of context and compassion, accurate enough to land precisely where they were aimed. Damon did not give up. This was one of the things Stefan would carry from this period, when he eventually came back to himself to carry anything. The knowledge that Damon had not walked away when given every reason to. The brother to whom he had said unforgivable things had continued to show up, continued to push against the blankness, continued to behave as though the Stefan inside the Ripper was a person worth the effort of reaching. Stefan had no response to this in the moment that it was happening, but the knowledge of it was being stored somewhere below the level of the switch, filed away in the part of him that the suppression had not entirely reached. Elena came herself. This was the complication Klaus had not fully anticipated, because Klaus's model of Elena was incomplete. He understood her as a doppelganger, a resource, a variable in his calculations, but he had not fully accounted for who she was as a person, which was a significant oversight. She came with Damon, and she put herself directly in Stefan's path, and what happened in their encounter was one of the stranger experiences of Stefan's long existence. He did not feel what he should have felt looking at her. The switch held. Her face, her voice, the specific quality of her attention directed at him. None of it penetrated the suppression in the way she had clearly hoped it would. He was not cold to her the way he had been cold to Damon. He was something more disorienting, something she had not prepared herself for. He was indifferent, or nearly so. The warmth she had known in him simply absent. The space it occupied filled with a pleasant blankness that was arguably more frightening than hostility would have been. She did not accept it as final. He would learn later that she had identified something in that encounter, some evidence beneath the flatness that told her the switch was a mechanism rather than a permanent state, that Stefan was inside the Ripper rather than replaced by him. She had looked at the creature in front of her and found the outline of the person she was looking for, faint but present, and she had held onto that outline in the months that followed with a tenacity that did not require his participation or his gratitude. Klaus's hybrid project eventually stalled in a way that forced a reckoning with its fundamental flaw. The problem with the blood, Elena needing to be alive for it to work, the whole enterprise requiring revision. The complications brought the situation back to Mystic Falls, where the threads of multiple ongoing crises were converging with the inevitability of things that have been building toward a specific point for a long time. Stefan's return to himself was not a single moment. It was a process begun by Elena and Damon's sustained efforts and completed by a series of events that created internal pressure the switch was not sufficient to contain. The grief of what he had done in the Ripper period, when it arrived all at once in the way of things that have been deferred rather than diminished, the total weight undistributed across time. He had killed people. He had been cruel to his brother and indifferent to Eleanor, and had operated as Klaus's instrument for months with a compliance that had required at its root the destruction of everything he had spent decades carefully building. The self-recrimination was immense and familiar. He had been here before, in the aftermath of Ripper periods, standing in the wreckage of his own behavior, trying to determine what was salvageable and what was simply gone. The difference this time was the scale of what needed to be accounted for, and the complicating fact that he had chosen this, had walked into it deliberately, which made the usual defenses unavailable. Eleanor did not offer him easy forgiveness. She was not cold, but she was honest, and her honesty included the truth that what she had watched him do and become in the preceding months had cost her something that simple. Relief at his return could not entirely restore. Stefan accepted this with the equanimity he was trying to reconstruct, understanding that it was not a withdrawal of her feeling for him, but an honest accounting of its current state. He could work with honest accountings. He had less capacity for the comfortable fictions that forgiveness sometimes masqueraded as. Damon said nothing particularly useful and nothing particularly cruel, which for Damon represented a significant exercise of restraint. Stefan recognized it as such, which was its own form of communication between brothers who had developed across 150 years an extraordinary accumulated damage. A language made largely of what was not said. Klaus still had claims on Stefan's compliance, levers he was not done using, and the situation with the originals was far from resolved. The Ripper period was over, but its consequences were not, and Mystic Falls was a town that had developed a particular talent for producing new crises before the previous ones had been fully addressed. Stefan stood in the autumn light, 2011, and understood that he was back, and that being back meant carrying the full weight of what he had done while he was away. He had done this before. The weight was familiar, if not comfortable. He picked it up and kept moving, because that was what he did, and because the people he was moving toward were worth the effort of the carrying. Stefan's return to himself in the winter of 2011 did not produce a clean restoration of the life he had been living before Klaus. That life had been built on a particular set of circumstances that no longer existed in their original form, and the process of understanding what had changed and what remained required the kind of careful inventory that Stefan had become expert at taking across 150 years of complicated existence. He'd come back from Ripper periods before, had stood in the aftermath of his own behavior trying to determine what was salvageable and what was simply gone. But this return carried a specific weight that the previous ones had not. He had chosen the Ripper this time. He had walked into it deliberately, for reasons he believed were good, and the deliberateness made the usual defenses unavailable. There was no circumstance to blame, no overwhelming compulsion to cite, no moment of weakness he could point to as the origin of everything that followed. He had looked at the available options and chosen Klaus, and living with that choice required a different quality of accounting than the ones he had performed before. Elena was different, not in the fundamental sense, not in the qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place. The directness, the empathy, the specific courage she brought to every impossible situation. Those remained intact and fully recognizable, the core of who she was untouched by the preceding months. But something had shifted in the architecture of her feelings during his absence, some internal rearrangement she was still in the process of understanding herself. And Stefan was perceptive enough and honest enough to see it, even when seeing it was not something he would have chosen. There is a particular quality to the attention a person gives to someone they have been worried about for a long time and are relieved to have back. And Eleanor's attention to Stefan in those early weeks had that quality. But there was another quality present alongside it, something quieter and more complicated, something that had not been there before he left, and that she was not yet naming aloud. He did not name it for her. He gave the situation room, allowed Elena the space to settle back into the rhythms of ordinary life, insofar as ordinary life was available to them in Mystic Falls. And he watched with careful attention the way she moved between himself and Damon without pressing for clarification. He could see she was not yet ready to offer. He was not surveilling her, not building a case. He was simply paying the kind of attention that people who love someone carefully pay to the truth of what they observe, because that truth was going to matter regardless of how long it took to fully surface. He also resumed his animal blood diet with the discipline of someone returning to a practice they understand to be non-negotiable. The Ripper period had undone months of careful maintenance, and the reconstruction of his control required the same patient consistency it had always required. No shortcuts, no renegotiating the terms he had established for himself. Lexi would have recognized the work. She would also have recognized the specific quality of Stefan's emotional state in those weeks, the way he was managing his grief at the cost of the period, not by suppressing it, but by converting it into action, into usefulness, into the forward motion that had always served him better than stillness. The situation deteriorated in the spring of 2012 in the way that things in Mystic Falls always deteriorated, rapidly, with multiple complications arriving simultaneously, each one rendering the previous arrangement insufficient for the new conditions. Elena died on Wickery Bridge, the same bridge where Miranda and Grayson Gilbert had died, the same dark water, the same night sky. She had Damon's blood in her system from an injury sustained earlier, blood that had been given to her as a protective measure against exactly the kind of fatal outcome that had now occurred. And she came back from the water changed in the way that everyone who comes back changed does. Slowly, with the full weight of what had happened arriving in stages rather than all at once. Stefan had been working toward a cure for vampirism. This was the specific and terrible irony nested inside the larger grief of Elena's transition. He had been pursuing the cure as the solution that would restore her human future. The future she had explicitly said she wanted, and she had become a vampire before the cure could be found. The pursuit had not been fast enough. The protection had not held. And now the thing he'd been trying to prevent had happened anyway. He carried this privately, in the way he carried most of the things that were most difficult, without making his own guilt the organizing principle of the situation, because Elena needed his attention directed outward toward her rather than inward toward himself. Her transition was difficult in the way that emotionally sensitive people's transitions tend to be difficult, which is to say, it was extremely difficult. The amplification operating at a level that made the early weeks almost unbearable to witness from the outside and certainly to experience from the inside. Her already considerable capacity for feeling became something beyond ordinary management, every emotion arriving at a volume and intensity that flooded her ability to moderate her responses. She wept with a completeness that was almost physical in its force. She raged with an incandescence that frightened her and required Stefan's careful, consistent presence to help her understand that the feeling was temporary, that it would become less overwhelming with time and practice, that she was not being unmade by what she was experiencing but remade, which was painful but not the same thing as destruction. He fed her, which required its own delicacy, because Elena's relationship with the blood and with the feeding was complicated by her moral core in ways that Stefan recognized from his own early years. The guilt of hunger, the self-recrimination of wanting something that cost another person, the difficulty of accepting that the body's needs did not align with the mind's values. He knew this territory intimately, and he navigated it with her with the patience of someone who had spent decades in similar terrain. He stayed with her through the worst nights, the nights when the hunger was strongest and the grief was loudest, and the gap between who she had been and what she was becoming seemed unbridgeable. He talked her through it. He sat in the silence with her when talking was not what was needed. He was present with a consistency that did not require acknowledgement or reciprocation, because that was what she needed, and giving people what they needed had always been the most reliable expression of Stefan's love for them. The intimacy of those weeks was genuine and deep, and in other circumstances, it might have drawn them closer together in permanent ways, rather than clarifying what was already changing between them. But the sire bond changed the conditions of everything it touched. The discovery arrived with the quality of information that dismantles the interpretive framework one has been using to understand a situation, forcing a reconstruction from the foundation rather than a simple revision of the upper floors. A sire bond in vampires is a rare phenomenon, occurring when a human carries particularly deep feelings for a vampire before their transformation, those feelings becoming supernaturally entangled with the blood connection at the moment of transition. It manifests as an orientation toward the sired vampire that goes beyond ordinary preference, a compulsion to please and to align oneself with that vampire's wishes that compromises the autonomy of the feeling itself from the inside. Elena was sire to Damon, which meant that the feelings for Damon that had been developing across 2 years, the feelings Stefan had been observing with careful attention, the feelings Elena had not yet fully named, were not reliably her own, or rather, and this was the distinction that made the whole situation genuinely impossible to resolve cleanly. They might be genuinely her own. They might be real feelings that had existed before the bond and had been incorporated into it, feelings that would have developed on their own trajectory even without the supernatural amplification. Or they might be the bond's creation rather than its amplification. There was no method from the inside for distinguishing between these two possibilities with any confidence. Elena could not know whether she loved Damon freely or whether the bond had manufactured a love that would not have existed without it, and Damon could not know either. And Stefan found himself in the position of loving someone whose fundamental feelings about his brother existed in a condition of irresolvable uncertainty. He sat with this information for longer than might have been expected, because sitting with difficult information before acting on it was one of the habits he had developed across a very long life. He turned it over from multiple angles, tested the different implications of different responses, tried to find a position that honored both what he felt and what he believed, which were not perfectly aligned in this situation and required careful navigation to bring into working agreement. What he believed was this: Elena's autonomy was not negotiable. The specific quality of her that he had loved from the beginning, her genuine agency, the realness of her choices, the fact that she moved through the world making decisions that were truly hers, was not something he could set aside in order to preserve a version of their relationship that existed under a cloud of fundamental uncertainty. He had spent his earliest vampire years having his own feelings about Catherine manufactured by compulsion, had lived 145 years inside the grief of a love he had eventually learned was not entirely his own, and he understood from the inside what it cost a person to discover that the feelings they had trusted as their most intimate truth had been interfered with by external forces. He was not willing to ask Elena to live inside that uncertainty with him, and he was not willing to live inside it himself. He stepped back, gradually at first, in the way that honest withdrawals happen gradually when the person withdrawing is being careful rather than cowardly, and then with more explicit acknowledgement when Elena pressed for the truth of what was happening. He told her honestly and completely, the way he had learned to tell her hard things, without softening the parts that were most difficult, without dressing the decision in language designed to make it easier to receive than it actually was. He was stepping back not because he had stopped loving her, but because he could not accept a version of her love for him or his competition with Damon that existed in the shadow of a supernatural compulsion neither of them could fully account for. He wanted her free choice more than he wanted her choice to be him. She did not receive this well because it was not a receivable thing. It was simply the truth, and what she did with it was hers to determine. The grief settled over Stefan in stages across the following weeks and months, and he allowed it to settle rather than trying to manage it into something more efficient. He had learned that grief does not respond well to the imposition of timelines, that the work of it takes what it takes regardless of how much one would prefer otherwise. He had loved Elena genuinely, with a completeness and an openness that he had not managed in the period since Catherine had dismantled his trust in his own feelings, and the daily loss of that love was a real wound that he did not minimize by packaging it into something more socially manageable. He redirected into action, because action was one of his oldest and most reliable coping strategies. The cure remained his project, pursued now with a different motivation than before, but with no less determination. He traveled when the situation allowed it, gathered information, built alliances with people who had relevant knowledge of the cure's location and requirements. He stayed useful to the people in Mystic Falls who needed him, which was most of them most of the time, because that was what Mystic Falls required, and because usefulness had always served Stefan better than stillness in periods of personal difficulty. Damon came to him eventually. This happened in the way that important conversations between them always happened, late and without ceremony, in a moment when the usual performances were too exhausting to maintain, and the history between them was too immediate to pretend away. Damon said things that were more honest than he usually permitted himself to be in Stefan's direct presence. About Elena, about the feelings he'd been carrying and the guilt that accompanied them, about the specific discomfort of having developed love for the person who had been his brothers. Stefan listened with the full attention the conversation deserved, because Damon speaking honestly was not something to waste, and because the truth of what Damon was saying was real enough to merit genuine engagement rather than deflection. He told Damon that if Elena chose him freely, when the bond was resolved and her choice was genuinely her own, then Stefan wanted her to be happy more than he wanted her to choose differently. He said this and meant it. The work of getting to the place where it was genuinely true, rather than a performance of equanimity over hidden devastation, had been considerable and private, and had taken longer than he might have wished. But he had done it, because it was the kind of thing that had to be done alone, that no one else could do for you, and that had no shortcut. The sire bond was eventually broken. The conditions required for its dissolution met through a series of events that tested everyone involved. When it was broken, when Eleni stood on the other side of it, in full possession of her own feelings without supernatural interference, what remained was love for Damon. Real love. Her own. Stefan knew before she told him, had watched the truth of it, becoming clearer as the bond receded, and when she came to him, he received it with the equanimity he had constructed over months of patient internal work. It hurt. He would not have claimed otherwise. The loss had the specific quality of something set down rather than taken, which was a distinction that mattered enormously to Stefan, even if it was invisible from the outside. He had made the choices that led here. He'd stepped back, had released his claim on her happiness when the bond was resolved, had wanted her freedom more than he wanted her proximity. The pain was therefore not something being done to him, but the cost of what he believed, and he had decided months ago that it was a cost worth paying. He paid it without complaint, which was perhaps the most genuinely mature thing Stefan Salvatore had done in 150 years of complicated living. The people around him noticed the grief and said various things about it, some useful and some not. Lexi, when Stefan called her, said exactly the right things in exactly the right order, and then told them to stop calling her at 2 a.m. unless someone was dying. He laughed, which he had not expected to be capable of, and the laugh was real. Mystic Falls did not pause for his heartbreak, because Mystic Falls never paused for anything. There were new threats forming, new crises assembling themselves from the raw material of a town that seemed constitutionally incapable of remaining quiet for longer than a few weeks at a time. The cure existed somewhere, required finding, and Stefan's pursuit of it gave structure to a period that might otherwise have been organized entirely around loss. He was useful. He was moving. He was choosing every morning to get up and continue rather than surrender to the alternative. He was 163 years old, and he was heartbroken, and he was still here, in the ledger of Stefan Salvatore's life, still being here, after everything that had accumulated in that ledger was not a small entry. It was, some days, the most important one. He held on to it on the hardest days, the ones when the boarding house was too quiet, and Eleanor's absence from it had a particular weight. He was not done. He had been through worse than this, and had found his way back to something worth living for. He had been through the Ripper, and through the guilt of Giuseppe, and through Damon's departure, and through a century of relapse and recovery, and he was still capable of the things that mattered, still capable of love, still capable of choice, still capable of the good that had always been the thing worth fighting for inside him. That was not nothing. For Stefan Salvatore, after everything the world had used to argue against the possibility of it, that was very nearly everything. The cure was found and lost, and found again in the way that things of great consequence tend to move through the lives of people in mystic. Fools, never cleanly, never without cost, never arriving at the moment when its arrival would have been most useful. By the time it was in hand, the person who had most wanted it had changed her mind about wanting it, and the circumstances surrounding its administration were nothing like what anyone had planned. This was the specific quality of living in that town, of being attached to the people in it. The solutions always arrived late and sideways, and the work of accepting them in whatever form they took was itself a form of the work that never ended. Stefan had pursued the cure through the spring of 2013 with the focused determination that characterized his best periods, the ones where grief had been converted into forward motion, and motion was producing something useful rather than simply filling the space that stillness left open. The pursuit had taken him to a remote island off the coast of Nova Scotia, through a series of dangers that tested the physical and moral resources of everyone in their group, and into proximity with a figure whose existence changed the parameters of everything Stefan thought he understood about immortality, about vampirism, about the very origins of what he was. Silas had been the world's first true immortal. Predating the vampire species by thousands of years, his immortality achieved through magic of a scale and precision that had not been replicated since. He had been entombed on that island for 2,000 years, desiccated by the absence of blood, starving in the specific and terrible way that immortal creatures starve. Fully conscious, fully aware of time passing, unable to die, but unable to truly live. The people who had put him there had understood that killing him was not possible, that entombment was the only available solution, and they had chosen an island and a safe, and the hope that 2,000 years of isolation would constitute a sufficient sentence. He was not grateful for the rescue. He was instead dangerous in the way that ancient things with nothing left to lose are dangerous, operating at a scale that made every threat Stefan had encountered in 165 years seem manageable by comparison. His power was primarily psychic, the ability to take the form of anyone, to project constructed realities into the minds of those around him with a fidelity that made the constructions indistinguishable from genuine experience. He could appear as Damon, as Elena, as anyone Stefan had ever loved. wearing their faces and their voices and their mannerisms with perfect accuracy. And the terror of this was not simply the disorientation of false appearances, but the deeper terror of no longer being able to trust one's own perceptions. He was also Stefan's doppelganger, which was the detail that arrived with the particular force of things that reconfigure one's understanding of one's own history. When Silas finally revealed his true face, Stefan found himself looking at his own features arranged on something ancient and fundamentally inhuman. The same structure, the same coloring, the same face that Stefan had been carrying since 1847, now serving as the original of which he was a copy. Stefan had known about doppelgangers in the abstract, had known that Elena's resemblance to Catherine was not coincidence, but the result of a supernatural lineage that produced copies across generations. He had not fully absorbed that this lineage had its own origin, that somewhere at the beginning of the chain there was a source, and that the source looked like him. Silas put Stefan in a safe and dropped him in a quarry lake. He did this efficiently and without drama, treating it as a practical problem solved with a practical solution. And then he went to Mystic Falls, wearing Stefan's face to live Stefan's life, while Stefan remained in the dark water below. What followed was the most sustained suffering of Stefan Salvatore's long existence, which is a statement that requires acknowledgement of the competition. He had burned for 3 days in his transformation. He had killed his father. He had been the Ripper across decades of violence that left trails of horror through American cities. He had spent months as Klaus's instrument, his humanity switched off, doing things that his returned self would spend years accounting for. All of these were entries in the ledger of Stefan's suffering, real and significant and not to be minimized, but the safe was different from all of them in a specific way that made it uniquely damaging. Every previous suffering had allowed some form of agency, some possibility, however remote, of response or resistance or action. The Ripper at least could move. The transformation at least ended. Even the darkest periods of his relapse had contained within them the theoretical possibility of the choice to stop, however incapable he had been of making that choice in the moment. The safe contained nothing. No movement possible, no action available, no choice to make, no response to offer. Just the dark and the cold, and the cycling of desiccation and agonized revival as his body degraded and recovered in its terrible vampire rhythm. The consciousness preserved him full through every cycle. Nothing to do with that consciousness except experience the situation with complete unmediated awareness. He survived it by going inward in a way that he had never previously had occasion to go. The external world having been entirely removed as a resource, Stefan turned to the interior landscape of his own history with a thoroughness that years of movement and action had always allowed him to avoid. He thought about everyone, not with the selective, managed quality of normal memory, where one chooses what to visit and what to leave alone, but with the comprehensiveness of someone with no other available material. His mother appeared, and his father, and Damon, and Lexi, and Catherine, and Elena, and every person he had killed, and every person he had tried to save, and every person who had tried to save him. He moved through 165 years of accumulated experience with the patient thoroughness of someone cataloguing an archive, not looking for conclusions or resolutions, but simply allowing the material to be present in a place where there was nothing else. He thought about Caroline Forbes with a frequency that surprised him, given that there were older attachments and more dramatic histories available to his consideration. She appeared not in the context of any specific crisis or pivotal moment, but in the ordinary ones. The quality of her laugh, the specific way she organized her arguments, the manner in which she moved through difficulty with a combination of determination and genuine feeling that he had always found both admirable and, if he was honest with himself, in the total way the safe was requiring him to be, deeply appealing. The warmth he felt in the direction of these memories was uncomplicated in a way that most of his emotional responses were not, and he filed this observation away for examination if and when examination became possible. Damon found him. The circumstances surrounding the rescue were complicated, involving Silas's eventual defeat and the unwinding of the doppelganger situation. But what mattered to Stefan in the immediate sensory reality of being pulled from the lake was simpler than any of the surrounding complexity: air, sky. His brother's voice, identifiably Damon's rather than another of Silas's constructions, because by then Silas was no longer a variable. He breathed and he looked upward, and he allowed himself to understand that the safe was over. The recovery was not simple, and he had known it would not be. What surprised him was the specific form the damage had taken. He had expected the Ripper to resurface with the force of months of accumulated deprivation, the pressure finding its usual release in catastrophic loss of control. What he found instead was a fragmentation of a different kind, a disruption to the basic reliability of his own perceptions that the months of Silas's psychic manipulation and the sensory deprivation of the safe had produced in combination. He did not always know what was real. He would see people who were not there. He would look at Damon and feel the flicker of uncertainty about whether this was Damon or another Silas projection, and the flicker was brief, but it was present, and its presence was his own form of damage because it reached into the fundamental instrument of his functioning and introduced unreliability into the instrument itself. He told Damon fragments of this, enough for Damon to understand the scale of what had happened. Damon's response was characteristically imperfect and characteristically sincere, the specific combination that Stefan had long since learned to accept as Damon's particular form of love, not graceful, not always well expressed, but real and persistent and worth receiving on its own terms. He told Caroline more completely, and her response was the thing that helped him most in the weeks of reconstruction. She did not try to manage the information or reframe it into something more optimistic, or offer solutions to a problem that did not have solutions in the immediate term. She listened with the full weight of her presence, asked the questions that helped him understand what he was actually trying to say, and then simply remained available in the daily, undramatic way that turned out to be exactly what was needed. Their friendship had been building for 3 years by the time of the safe. Through the accumulated experience of being in hard situations together and repeatedly discovering that the other person was someone who could be counted on when counting on someone, was not a hypothetical exercise. Caroline had been turned against her will, had navigated her own transition with a combination of horror and determination, and had eventually arrived at a relationship with her vampire nature that was genuinely integrated rather than simply managed. she was not at peace with all of it, would not have claimed to be. But she had done the real work of incorporation rather than the easier work of suppression, and the result was a person who understood from the inside the experience of being something that required more effort to be well than most creatures were asked to produce. She saw Stefan clearly, which was the specific quality of her attention that he valued most, not the ripper deployed as warning or explanation, not the romantic figure, the devoted lover, the responsible counterweight to Damon. Stefan himself, with all of it present, the darkness and the goodness and the guilt and the discipline and the history, and the person who had survived that history without being entirely consumed by it. She saw the whole of him and was not frightened by the parts that warranted wariness, because she understood those parts in a way that accurate understanding makes frightening things more manageable rather than less. He fell in love with her in the gradual way that he had not experienced in his previous loves, which had arrived with urgency and drama and the acceleration of compulsion or crisis. Caroline arrived like the slow change of seasons, each increment small enough to be almost imperceptible, the accumulation becoming undeniable only in retrospect. He could not have identified the specific day or conversation or shared experience that had moved friendship into love. He could only observe, at some point in the latter part of 2013, that the feeling was there and had clearly been building for longer than he had been paying attention to it, which meant it had arrived by its own route without requiring his supervision. He did not rush toward it. The timing of the safe and its aftermath meant that his own internal landscape required significant stabilization before he could offer anything meaningful to someone else. And Caroline was not someone to whom he was willing to offer something compromised by his own unresolved damage. He continued the friendship with the same consistency it had always had, continued being present for her across the crises of 2013 and 14, and trusted that what was true between them would remain true when the conditions were better suited to acknowledging it. Lily Salvatore's return from the prison world in 2015 arrived as one of the stranger developments in a life that had contained a remarkable number of strange developments. Stefan had believed his mother dead since childhood, had never had occasion to revise this belief, had processed her loss with a particular quality of childhood grief that becomes so thoroughly incorporated into one's sense of self that reopening it requires reopening the entire structure of self that was built around it. The woman who returned was not the mother of his memory, and could not be, because the memory was of a figure more imagined than known, softened by time and the protective mythology that children build around lost parents. Lily was old, and she was different, and she was complicated by the heretics, the group of witch vampire hybrids she had adopted as her family during the decades of her imprisonment. Her loyalties were genuinely divided in ways that were not strategic calculation, but honest feeling. She loved her sons, or was learning to love them again from a significant distance, but she also loved the heretics with the completeness of someone whose survival had depended on them through an extended period of genuine deprivation. Stefan could understand divided loyalty from the inside. He had spent 168 years navigating the space between who he loved and what those loves required of him, and he recognized the difficulty in his mother without requiring her to resolve it on a timeline that served his preferences rather than the reality of her situation. He tried to know her, not the version of her he had wanted, not the warm maternal figure of a memory that was mostly imagination, but the actual woman, difficult and old and complicated, carrying things he did not fully understand, offering what she could from the limited position of someone who had been absent for too long, to simply step back into relationship without rebuilding from nearly nothing. The trying was real, and it was more than he had expected to be capable of given the nature of the loss it required him to simultaneously hold. And it produced something between them that was not what he had hoped for, but was nonetheless true. She died before the distance could be fully bridged, which was the specific cruelty of the situation. Enough time to understand what might have been possible. Not enough time to make it actual. Stefan carried this loss with the same steady accounting he had developed for the other unrepairable losses in his ledger, neither minimizing it nor allowing it to become the organizing principle of his grief. She had been real. She had been his mother. They had tried. That was something. Not everything, but something. Stefan and Caroline became engaged in the spring of 2016. This statement requires some context to carry its full weight, because the path to it had not been linear, and the complications between the beginning of their friendship and the moment of the proposal had been considerable. There had been a period when Caroline had turned off her own humanity, had moved through a phase of emotional shutdown that Stefan recognized with the intimate familiarity of someone who had traveled that road multiple times himself, and the work of being present for her through that period without trying to force a return she was not ready to make had required a patience he had only developed across 168 years of learning it the hard way. He had not pressed. He had remained available in the way that Lexi had remained available for him, understanding that the choice to return had to be made from the inside. That external pressure on the mechanism produced resistance rather than resolution, and Caroline had returned on her own terms and in her own time, and what she came back to included Stefan in the specific way that mattered, the way that was not simply friendship or comfort or shared history, but the whole of what had been building between them across 4 years of accumulated knowing. She said yes when he asked her. She said it with a particular quality of certainty that she brought to the things that actually mattered to her. Not performed, not qualified, not hedged against the possibility of regret. Just yes, clear and warm and entirely her own. Stefan received it with a stillness that was different from his usual controlled stillness, not managed calm, but the genuine quiet of someone who has arrived somewhere they had not fully believed they would reach. 168 years old, engaged to someone who loved him fully, freely, with complete knowledge of what he was, and a choice made without any of the compulsion or crisis that had characterized his previous loves. The full weight of what this meant took time to arrive, as the full weight of genuinely good things often does, the mind approaching it gradually rather than all at once, because all at once would be too much to absorb without distortion. Stefan Salvatore, who had died at 17 and woken as a monster and spent 150 years in cycles of darkness and recovery and darkness again, who had killed his father and surrendered to the Ripper and been locked in the dark water and lost people he could not afford to lose. This person was here present, choosing love in full knowledge of its cost, being chosen in return. He allowed himself to feel this without immediately converting it into something more manageable. He sat inside it for a moment, the way he had learned to sit inside the difficult things when sitting was the right response. Then he looked at Caroline, who was looking at him with the expression she had that meant she was seeing all of it and was not looking away. And he understood that whatever came next, whatever the town of Mystic Falls and its inexhaustible appetite for crisis had yet to produce, he was not facing it alone. He had not been alone for a long time, he realized. He had been alone in his own mind, had maintained the habit of solitude long past its usefulness, had continued performing self-sufficiency as a default condition, even when the people around him had long since made the performance unnecessary. But the aloneness had been a habit, and habits could be recognized and set down, and this one was ready to be set down. He set it down. He was 168 years old, and he was loved, and he was present in his own life in a way that the safe and the ripper and the long road from Mystic Falls in 1864 had conspired to make him believe might not be permanently available to him. It was available. It had always been available. He had just needed long enough to stop running from it before he could find his way to it. The end, when it came as Stefan's ends had always threatened to come, not in some distant future of his own imagining, but in the immediate present, in the specific moment when the people he loved needed something that only he could give, and giving it required everything. Mystic Falls had always had a way of calling its debts. The town had been built on violence and secrecy, and the accumulated cost of generations of people who had made choices whose consequences outlasted their ability to manage them. The hellfire that threatened to consume the town in the final days was not an abstraction, not a distant possibility to be theorized about and prepared for at leisure. It was coming, it was real, and the calculations of who could stop it and how produced an answer that Stefan received, with the quiet recognition of someone who has been, on some level, preparing for exactly this kind of answer for 170 years. He had taken the cure. This is where the final chapter of Stefan Salvatore's story requires the most careful attention, because the decision to take the cure and the decision to sacrifice himself were not separate events connected by circumstance. They were a single decision, made at once, with full understanding of what taking one meant for the other. The cure would make him human, after 170 years of vampire existence, after everything the transformation had made possible and everything it had made terrible. Human, which meant mortal, which meant that what came next would be the last thing rather than one more thing in an indefinitely long series. He had wanted the cure in the abstract for a long time. He had pursued it for Elena's sake, had watched it be used and lost and found again across the years of its complicated history in his life. But when it came to him finally, when the possibility of taking it himself was real and immediate, what he felt was not the simple relief of someone receiving something long desired. It was more complicated than that, more layered. A recognition that the cure and the sacrifice it would enable were the same gesture. An understanding that the most human thing he could do with his returned humanity was to spend it immediately on the people he loved. Catherine Pierce was at the center of what needed to happen, which had a particular and terrible symmetry to it. Catherine, whose arrival in Mystic Falls in 1864 had set the entire trajectory of Stefan's existence in motion. Catherine, for whom he had been willing to die at 17, not knowing that death would not take in the way he expected. Catherine, who had never loved him and had used the love he bore her with the casual efficiency of someone for whom other people's feelings were primarily resources. She was the instrument of the hellfire, the one who needed to be driven into it, and Stefan was the one positioned to drive her. He said goodbye to Damon. This was the moment that carried the most weight in the final hours, the conversation between brothers that had been 170 years in the making, that contained inside it every version of their relationship across all the time they had existed as what they were. They had been enemies and allies and sources of each other's deepest damage and most essential support. And the distance between them at any given moment had been less important than the constancy of the connection beneath the distance. The fact that through everything Damon had remained his brother in the ways that mattered, imperfect and infuriating and irreplaceable. Damon wanted to be the one to do it. This was Damon's instinct, consistent across 170 years, to absorb the cost himself rather than watch Stefan absorb it, which was a form of love that Damon expressed through action, because expressing it through words had always been the harder direction for him. Stefan would not allow it, not because Damon's sacrifice would have been less valid or less meaningful, but because Stefan had spent 170 years accumulating the specific understanding of what this moment required, and the understanding was his. The choice was his. He had made choices that cost other people enormously across his long existence, and this was the choice that cost only himself, and he was not willing to give it away. He walked into the hellfire with Catherine, carrying the weight of what he was doing with the same steady accounting he had brought to all of his hardest choices, the same refusal to look away from the full truth of what the moments contained. He was human. He was mortal. He was 17 years old in the only sense that had ever mattered, the sense in which we are always the age at which we became ourselves, and he was dying in Mystic Falls as he had died in Mystic Falls before, except that this time the dying was entirely his own. Lexi was there, on the other side. This was right. It was exactly right that the person who had believed in him most consistently across the longest span, who had found him in his worst periods and refused to accept those periods as his final word, would be the first face he saw in whatever came after. They stood together in the quiet of that liminal space, and what passed between them did not require much language, because they had always communicated most honestly in the silences. Stefan Salvatore had lived for 170 years in the shadow of what he was capable of at his worst, and he had died in the full light of what he was capable of at his best. He had been a monster, and he had been a man, and he had understood, finally, that neither one of those things was the whole truth, and both of them together were something worth having been. He was not a hero because he was strong. He was a hero because he kept choosing good after choosing good had cost him everything, and then kept choosing it again. He was a hero because the darkness in him was real and known, and never fully defeated, and he chose against it anyway, every time, for 170 years, until the choosing itself became the most essential fact of who he was. The town of Mystic Falls grew still. The night settled over the old houses and the familiar streets and the cemetery where everything had begun. The same Virginia dark that had held the Salvatore estate in 1864. The same stars overhead that had been overhead when Stefan Salvatore fell in the road outside his father's house and woke as something other. He was at peace. After 170 years of war with himself, after everything the long road from that autumn night had cost him and taken from him and asked of him, Stefan Salvatore was finally, completely at peace. Let that peace settle over you now. Let the story of this long life rest quietly in the space between waking and sleep, carrying you gently toward the dark. The fire has gone out. The town is still. And somewhere beyond the edges of the story, in the quiet that follows every long journey home, Stefan Salvatore is exactly where he was always trying to get to. Rest now. The night holds everything gently. Good night.